let's talk about American history. Emily suggested we talk about the War of 1812, so that's what we're going to do today. The War of 1812 is not a very well-known war in terms of, like, wars in American history. So, most of the time it's kind of known as, like, the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Second War of American Independence. And in a lot of ways it really is. We're fighting against the British over similar territory, and though the specifics are a little bit different, generally the same ideals. So the origins and kind of the lens that we have to view this through is through a couple of different lenses. First is through the Greater Napoleonic lens. Essentially, because of the Napoleonic Wars, we, as Americans, I'm going to say we, because I'm American and that's just the way that it's going to happen, we were not trading with Great Britain, which was an issue for them because they'd lost the colonies, they'd lost the natural resources that we had here, and now we're not even trading with them at all. So they're at an economic, like, downfall because of that. So they don't like us. We're having issues with them independently. Then we have the issue with the war hawks. You have John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, both of whom were new. They didn't have the opportunity to fight in the Revolutionary War. They were young men, and they really were looking for a fight to go to war. Earlier in James Madison's administration, they kind of took on the Native Americans as we tried to achieve manifest destiny. They tried to push them outwards and westwards. And so they'd had some success with that. First of all, they kind of broke up the Native Confederation by discrediting someone that we know as the Prophet. They discredited him as a leader, and it caused his brother Tecumseh to align with the British. So we had the Native Confederation, though it was substantially weaker, it was now aligned with the British. So you had that issue kind of on the western and northern front. And then you have the whole trading issue. That's something completely different. So the War of 1812 kind of has three major parts, geographically speaking. The first is the Canadian part. The second is the American part. And then finally, really like the Louisiana part, New Orleans. So first we have the Canadian part. We tried to invade Canada. Whether it was part of Manifest Destiny or just to, like, piss off the British, it happened. Invading Canada through the Great Lake region is not a very good idea if your navy consists of about 16 gunships and 1,000 men. And I'm only exaggerating a little bit. It was a very, very, very small military, and the fact that the Canadians didn't just, like, absolutely destroy us was thanks to William Henry Harrison, who later became president, and a man with one of the best names in all of American history, Oliver Hazard Perry. These two military leaders basically managed to ward off the Canadians, the British, the Canadians, whatever, managed to ward them off and stop them from invading the United States. So they went to Detroit, the British went back to Canada. It was fine. It was over. By the time 1814 rolled around, the British didn't really have to contend with France anymore, so they could send more resources to America and fight the former colonies. Napoleon had been exiled to Elba, all was well, except that it really wasn't, because things were going to get messy in here just a minute. So we weren't getting help from the French because they had their own problems to deal with. We didn't have a lot of money. Madison didn't have a lot of support of the Americans after what happened on the Canadian front. So by the time that the British actually landed in the Chesapeake Bay, the small militia pretty much scattered the second shots were fired. It was a disaster. And they burned the Capitol and ransacked the White House, essentially to drop morale. Like, haha, look what you want to declare independence from us? Okay, we're just gonna burn everything that you love. The biggest takeaway that we can take, and we can look at from American history, is the Star-Spangled Banner, which was written during the Battle of Fort McHenry when the British were trying to take over Baltimore. Ultimately, they gave up and set their sights elsewhere, which was New York. And when they invaded New York, it was upstate New York. They were trying to take over the St. Lawrence Seaway because it made sense. Like, Canada, Great Britain, or Canada, the United States. Okay, let's take over the St. Lawrence Seaway. Sounds like a plan. And really, it was only through the force of American ingenuity and like quick thinking and like just skill and strategy that we were not defeated by the British on that front. Essentially what happened was we put guns and cannons on both sides of the boat instead of just one. So instead of having to move the cannons back and forth whenever the boat moved, they were on both sides. And eventually the British moved back up into Canada, and that wasn't an issue. It kind of ended in a draw, and yeah, that happened. It was just kind of over before it was really started. The final front that we have to look at is New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson, who had earlier come in and defeated the Creek earlier in this kind of story. He defeated the British by fortifying his land, by knowing it, by knowing the port of New Orleans, and knowing how he could use the terrain to his benefit. It's a brilliant military mind, and managed to defeat a British invasion of twice the number of people. And I'm not like saying like 25 to 50. It was like 5,000 to 10,000. And only through his military genius, like, we didn't lose this battle. And it was a very decisive victory for the Americans. Interestingly enough, it actually happened about 2 weeks after, like, formalities and the war was over. But either news was traveling super slowly, or they just neglected to tell Jackson. Ultimately, the War of 1812 is kind of seen as, I mean, nothing was really gained from it territory-wise, so it's not necessarily seen as a victory in that sense. It did impact in two major ways that we would later see in American history. First of all, because of earlier in the war, the Native Americans were not a united front, so they were easier, they didn't stand for one cause. So by the time Jackson did want to move the Native Americans westward and southward, he could do so because they were not united at that point. Second of all, the second takeaway that we have to look at is it established the United States, and this is the most important thing, I think, that needs to be taken away from the War of 1812. It established the United States as a force to be reckoned with, as its own independent state, instead of just like, the former British colony. It's like the artist formerly known as Prince. The colonies formerly known as essentially, it established America as its own independent nation, who might not necessarily go to war for the best reasons, or the right reasons, or even with like the most amount of troops, or even an adequate number of troops, but we will fight, and because these are the things that we care about, we will win. And that's really what this boils down to. It is the Second War of American Independence, and it's probably the more important one because it establishes us as a credible, like, military nation. We have an established government, we have an established president, we have all these things that are established, and we can not lose a war. Like, we might not win the war, but we've definitely won the war in terms of, like, the international community, and anybody who disrespects us will probably have to deal with the Americans. So, does anybody have any questions?